My name is Hew Pike, and I am the CO of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 3 Para. On the 2nd of April, a Friday, and indeed we were to learn that most things happened on a Friday all through the Falklands campaign, we were both the Army's Spearhead Battalion and the Lead Parachute Battalion, and warned to embark on the Canberra, we finally sailed on her for the South Atlantic on the following Friday, Good Friday. My battalion was pretty well prepared, I believed, in all respects, to meet whatever lay ahead. And of course, what did lie ahead was at this stage very uncertain. But I was fairly sure, and I passed this on to my soldiers the first time I spoke to them, before we even left Tidworth, I was fairly sure that we were likely to have some sort of a war and some sort of a battle on our hands before the summer was out. And therefore, despite the fact that we were generally pretty well prepared for what lay ahead, the period of training and briefing and preparation on the Canberra was an extremely important one and a very useful one. We obviously concentrated on maintaining a standard of fitness, and I may say in some instances even improving our standard of fitness. And the Canberra, unlike many ships of the Royal Navy, gave us the opportunity to do this. And perhaps one of the first lessons one points to is the need for a high standard of physical readiness in terms of physical fitness, because very often this chance, in terms of either time or resources, the chance to get fit on a ship will simply not be there. Apart from physical training every day, we concentrated on polishing up our weapon skills and other predictable matters, such as deciding exactly what scales of ammunition, clothing and equipment each soldier should carry, dependent on his job in the battalion, and studying the level of enemy forces, their capabilities, their morale, their organization, and studying, of course, the maps of the terrain that we were likely to have to cross. In addition to that, when we arrived at Ascension Island, we had nearly 2 weeks lying at anchor there during the period of diplomatic negotiations and during the period of the build-up of the task force shipping. And during that time, we were able to get ashore and carry out some very useful live firing and indeed practice a helicopter assault operation onto Wide Awake Airfield. We also polished up our skills in disembarking from the Canberra into the landing craft which we expected that we would have to go ashore in when D-Day came. We then sailed south, and on the 19th of May, 2 days before D-Day, rather to my surprise, but I believe very sensibly, we were cross-decked from the Canberra to HMS Intrepid, an assault ship. And this perhaps brings out another immediate lesson, and that is that if you think surprising things happen on exercises, you would be even more astonished at what surprising things happen in war, because you never really know from one day to the next how the plan is going to change, what the enemy are going to do, and how unpredictable events can be. We were very, very cramped on HMS Intrepid, and I think it's true to say that not even a section commander during that 48 hours before D-Day really could be sure of where all his soldiers were at any one moment. And it was very disconcerting to be so cramped just before we were due to carry out the landing. However, we had carried out all our briefing and preparation on the Canberra, and so when we cross-decked, every soldier knew exactly what he had to do, what his part in the plan was, and he had with him, of course, all the equipment to do it. On D-Day, our task was to land at Green 1 Beach, Sand Bay, near Port San Carlos settlement, and to move into that settlement and to secure it. This we did successfully. Shortly after first light, the landings should have been all in the dark, but again, for reasons beyond everybody's control, the first phase of the landings took longer than expected, and many things do take longer in war than expected. and so it was daylight by the time we got ashore. And the relief of getting ashore from Intrepid on a beautiful early morning with geese on the hillside and duck flying over the water, a lot of bird life, on this very peaceful, beautiful morning, the relief of doing that was severely interrupted by some unpleasant realities which hit us very quickly. One was the shooting down of two Gazelle light reconnaissance helicopters by small arms fire from a withdrawing party of enemy withdrawing over the hills from Port San Carlos. Both the helicopters were completely destroyed and 3 of the 4 aircrew were killed. And shortly thereafter, the first Pucara ground attack with machine gun and rockets took place amongst the houses of the settlement. Thereafter, we carried out what you might describe best as routine in defense for about the next 6 days on the hills around Port San Carlos settlement. This was a period when the soldiers learnt very quickly to live in the field and expected to continue to live in the field for an indefinite period, something which of course does not happen on exercises. And I believe another lesson is that we do not spend long enough in the field on exercises, and it may sound absurd, but I think it was true to say that some of my very young soldiers were surprised when index was not declared after about 5 or 6 days. During this period, we also did a great deal of patrolling out of the bridgehead, not least to keep people on their toes and to keep them busy. This patrolling was in pretty foul weather conditions and was very tiring. And it's an interesting point of battle procedure that when, rather unexpectedly, we suddenly got on the move on Thursday the 26th of May, many of my soldiers were very tired because they had been patrolling, and I had expected that we would stay in that bridgehead for a further few days. A lesson in husbanding one's resources, perhaps. We set out on the 26th on a much more direct route to our next objective, which was Teal Inlet settlement, than Brigade had originally recommended to us. And here perhaps is a point concerning local knowledge. The brigade commander had tasked me to follow up behind 4-5 Commando to Douglas settlement, and then to pass through them and on to Teal Inlet. There appeared to be no particularly strong reason for doing this. It was a very significant dog's leg, and it seemed to me much more sensible if we advanced towards Teal Inlet concurrently with 4-5 Commando heading for Douglas settlement. And having spoken to the manager of the settlement of Port San Carlos, he confirmed that there was a much better direct route which we could take, and after consultation with the brigade commander, that is what we did. After about a 24-hour march, mostly by night, and the night in the Falkland Islands at this time of year was about 14 hours, and obviously we were anxious to do as much of our moving as possible at night. After the first 24 hours, we had broken the back of this very arduous journey across country to Teal Inlet. We had wisely, I believe, decided that we would only take with us our immediate needs, that is to say, ammunition, essential ammunition scales, hardly even a 24-hour ration pack, a few items from one Arctic ration pack only, a change of socks, and otherwise just our battle order, what we needed to fight in other words. And it was only by going light that we were able to negotiate by night this extraordinarily difficult terrain, terrain of high rock, deep bog, and no tracks of any sort whatsoever. Navigation was very important because, apart from anything else, navigational errors used up more physical strength, and soldiers became even more tired. And navigation was difficult. It was a matter of dead reckoning, and, for example, of using the fence lines, which are very accurately marked on the map, to assess how far we had advanced. On the second night of our advance, after having lain up in order to avoid possible air attack in the Arroyo Pedro River, a few kilometers short of Teal Inlet, on the second night we moved in, cutting off any possible retreating enemy on the far side of the settlement, and without difficulty secured Teal Inlet settlement. Thereafter, very quickly, I had further instructions from the brigade commander that he wanted me to continue the advance, and I was equally keen to do this. But I did have to take account, and indeed I was quite concerned by the fatigue of my soldiers at this stage and their inability to have any chance to change their socks, let alone dry out and have a bit of a rest. Particularly since the warning order for Estancia House, which was our next objective, stated that there was thought to be a force of about 200 enemy in that area. And again, this goes back to one of the cardinal principles of infantry operations, that progress must take account of the ability of subunits to fight a battle, should that be necessary, when they get to the far end. But we pressed on, and it was significant that during our advance to Teal Inlet, we had heard 2 paras battle at Goose Green to our south as we advanced through that first night. And as we waited at Teal Inlet to go on again on the Sunday night, we had news of the large-scale surrenders at Goose Green, and there's no doubt that buoyed everybody's morale and spirits quite considerably. And a similar pattern then developed. We marched for all of one night, a very difficult advance around a lot of water inlets, where again accurate navigation certainly paid off and proved to be very, very important. We then lay up during the hours of daylight, and on the second night of this second phase of our advance, we moved in the few remaining kilometres and secured Estancia House and the high ground around it. The enemy had fled before us, and again this objective was secured without difficulty. We then had quite a long wait from the 1st to the 10th of June. During this period, the 2nd Brigade, 5 Brigade, had landed, a divisional headquarters had arrived, and this, to some extent, imposed a break on the advance of 3 Commando Brigade. But very early on in this 10-day period, I was aware that our next objective was going to be Mount Longdon, which from the top of Mount Estancia obscured our view of the town of Stanley. We could also at this time see the airfield very clearly and the Hercules still landing on it, and most of the town of Stanley. Again, I had to balance the importance of keeping soldiers on their toes and highly charged, if you like, to balance that requirement against the need to rest them up for the undoubted battle that lay ahead. And this, I think, is a balance which a commander must always try to achieve. I used my patrol company extensively for reconnaissance around the area of Mount Longdon, and they were normally out for 2 or 3 nights at a time. It was an invaluable force to me, this, because I knew that I would not probably require them to take a leading part in the battle that lay ahead. And that enabled me largely to rest up the soldiers of my rifle companies, and indeed to give platoons on rotation a chance to get into a woolshed, to dry out a bit and sort themselves out and recover a bit from the very arduous advance which they had already completed. During this period we did do a number of fighting patrols, however, from all the rifle companies, because my company commanders were concerned that the soldiers would get rather bored and they needed something just to keep them on their toes. I tried to achieve what I might call a reconnaissance in force. I did not want severe battles with the enemy as a result of these fighting patrols. There was no need for them. We had sufficient information from our recce patrols, but there was this need to keep the aggressive spirit going during this waiting period. And I think we achieved that quite successfully. And then on the 10th of June, I received my orders for the attack on Mount Longdon. I had already a very clear idea of what those orders were going to be, and therefore I was able immediately that evening to issue my own orders for the battalion attack, and that gave my company commanders and rifle companies the whole of the following day, that is the 11th of June, the whole of that time for their battle procedure and the use of models and all the traditional briefing aids to get all their soldiers ready for the night attack of the 11th, 12th of June. An attack which we appreciated was perhaps the most important thing the battalion had to do, had to do for very many years. The brigade attack, this brigade attack by 3 Commando Brigade, was aimed to take the high ground of Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Mount Harriet, and thus 3 Commando Brigade aimed to close with the enemy's main defensive positions and to gain such a firm foothold on them that the enemy's position would thereafter be a hopeless one. And this is what was achieved by that brigade night attack. It was to be a silent attack because the distance over which we had to advance was very considerable. In our case, it was about a 3-hour advance. And it was interesting that during the period of intensive patrolling that preceded it, very few of our patrols were compromised in any way, and it seemed still on the 11th of June that the enemy did not have a clear idea of our intentions. This, interestingly, I believe was partly due to their own lack of understanding of the principles of defence, particularly the principle of defending well forward and patrolling really aggressively from their main defensive positions. And this played into our hands and enabled us to close right up with those positions with impunity. One of my concerns was the very open nature of the ground around Mount Longdon. And further to that, the lack of any detailed intelligence about the enemy positions beyond Mount Longdon, between the mountain and Stanley, that is, particularly in the area of Wireless Ridge. This meant that we could not realistically, even by night, and the nights were generally fairly bright with good visibility, we could not realistically hope to either outflank the position, let alone to ignore it. And therefore, really, the only sensible plan, taking into account the enemy minefields which we knew were immediately to the south of Mount Longdon, that the only plan could be a very simple one, whereby we fought our way from west to east steadily along this mountain. That in itself put a heavy premium on artillery fire, and certainly one of the great lessons of all these attacks was the importance to the infantry of very, very close and intimate artillery support. And I'm convinced the closest rounds that landed to us during our battle for the mountain were our own, from our 105mm guns and from the frigates. The execution of this battle, the description of how it went, I shall leave to one of my company commanders and one of my platoon commanders to describe to you in more detail. But there are certain points that I wish to emphasize now, which I think are important. The first, I've already mentioned, the essential nature of very, very intimate artillery fire support. We had an FOO with each company, and one of those was a naval gunfire support officer as well, and he controlled the guns of the frigate. The silent nature of our advance did mean that in gaining our initial foothold on the mountain itself, we did not, I believe, with hindsight, make as much use of artillery fire as we could and should have done. Whilst we were fighting for the area known as Fly Half, that is to say the western end of Mount Longdon, our artillery was mainly concerned with neutralizing the enemy positions further to the east around Full Back, and in the saddle between these two peaks of Fly Half and Full Back. It would have been possible, and I believe would have been to our advantage, if we had engaged for perhaps as much as 5 minutes, engaged with artillery fire the area of Fly Half immediately before my rifle platoons closed with that objective. and one would have seen them perhaps crouching in the rocks at the foot of the mountain with artillery fire coming down just a few meters to their front. And thus, I believe, they would have been enabled to get onto that position with less casualties. As it was, by the time my B company, had got onto that first part of the position, they had already sustained quite a number of casualties, although the company was still completely viable and fighting on thoroughly efficiently. The second important point, I think, is that command and control of an action such as this, which is in the dark, of course, is very, very difficult, particularly over ground which is broken, rocky, and where even a group of 3 or 4 soldiers cannot easily see what each other are doing at any given moment. And therefore, there is an enormous premium placed on the initiative, the training, and the discipline, and of course the bravery of soldiers at the lowest level. And I believe that in peacetime we compromise on the selection of soldiers and non-commissioned officers in terms of their quality at our peril. Certainly in this battle, as you will hear shortly, the demands placed on small groups working as teams, friends who probably knew each other very well and who trusted each other and who'd worked together many times on exercises. The importance of their ability to get forward and to deal thoroughly and systematically with the objectives which they faced was crucial in the securing of this objective. And the third point is, of course, firepower. We only had 1 machine gun in each section, and certainly we could have done with 2. We used the 66mm as bunker busters to very great effect, whereas we found that the Carl Gustav was rather heavy and cumbersome and tended to migrate towards company headquarters because the soldiers carrying it in a rifle platoon just could not fight and survive with it. The importance of automatic fire, both within the section, within the company, and of course from the SF machine guns and indeed Milan, was again a most important factor in the winning of this battle. We did not have with us any CVRT, either Scorpion or Scimitar, and they would, I think, have found this particular objective a very awkward one. But the message is that firepower is what wins battles, firepower is the great persuader, and the more you can acquire for an operation of this sort, the more likely you are to be successful. I shall make some further observations at the end of this account, but in the meantime, we're now going to hear from one of my company commanders, David Collett, and from one of my platoon commanders, Mark Cox, about their parts in this battle.
My name is Lieutenant Mark Cox. I command 5 platoon in B Company and commanded it for the Battle of Mount Longdon. I'm going to talk about the fighting through actually on the feature itself, and then I'll be followed by Major Collett from A Company. I'll start at the point where we were on the start line, just before the battle commenced. B Company were the first company to attack the hill, and we had 4 platoon left. My platoon was central, and 6 platoon were on the right. We'd all been given our various areas of responsibility on the feature by Sergeant Pettinger, who pointed them out, and who'd been on a patrol to the area himself a few nights before. So personally, I was able to see the precise area that my platoon were going to march towards. The men had put themselves in extended line, and we were waiting the word to go. The moon was behind the mountain, and you could see the outline of the hill silhouetted against the sky. When the word came to go, we relayed it to the sections, who then started off. And on the open grassy area that moved up towards the craggy rocky mountain itself, it was very easy to control the movement of the sections as we got up to the hill. I had one section right and two sections left, with three sections in the rear, and I was between my front two sections. Once we reached the hill, I had that strange feeling that we'd had at Teal Inlet and at Estancia, of getting ourselves into a formation, preparing for an action, and nothing was going to happen, because we'd marched all the way to the first rocks of Fly Half, and no enemy had either seen or heard us, and there'd been no reaction to our advance. Once we hit the rocks, we moved amongst them, but the terrain split the sections up. Some soldiers followed in single file, their section commander. Others moved around rocks and regrouped on the other side. There was a rock ridge which cut the platoon in half for a short period. And one of my first feelings as we got to the rocks was, crikey, how am I going to keep control of the three sections totally dispersed by the rocks here? Observation was my first thought, and I moved around quite a lot, talking to the section commanders on my radio, and we maintained the advance along the northern edge of Mount Longdon. As we were going along this edge, 4 platoon, who had been further to the north on the lower slopes of the northern half of the mountain, came up to a minefield, and Corporal Milne stepped on a mine, and the explosion obviously alerted the enemy. For very shortly after that, there was a lot of machine gun firing from high up on the top of Fly Half and the full back feature of the mountain. At this point, there was not an awful lot of fire coming down on my platoon, and it was very easy just to look up and see the tracer moving over the northern area of the hill. And our first concern was to see if we could do something about the gunfire up at the top of the hill. We kept the advance going, and my first casualty occurred very shortly after that. Private Hindmarsh was hit, and he had a flesh wound in the bottom, but we looked after him and continued the advance along the bottom, and in the knowledge that some of the firing that we could hear was now actually being directed at us. We had been seen moving amongst the rocks. One of the other features of the environment that I can't forget was the fact that that part of the hill, in the rocky shelter at the bottom there, the Argentinians obviously decided to use it as a latrine, and many of the soldiers taking cover behind the rock were absolutely covered. And however, we started to retaliate to some positions that we could now see, which gave themselves away by the blue muzzle flashes in the rocks. And the section commanders were grouping their sections as best they could, given the terrain, and using their 66s and the GPMGs were directing fire back at these positions. There wasn't too much resistance from these first positions, and we cleared through fairly rapidly along the northern side of the Fly Half feature. Using the 84mm, we had come unstuck a little bit. The weapon had misfired, and I remember seeing a weapon lying by a rock and going to pick it up and get one of the rounds that was lying there into action against a position that we'd just come across, and being told by the operator, "Don't touch that, sir, it's just not worth it." They'd tried with those rounds to deploy the weapon, but it hadn't worked, which was quite frustrating, because in practice you see how a heat round demolishes its target. It would have been very useful to have had that firepower, more convenient to deploy. However, the 66mm did work very well, and lots were used against positions on that northern side. In one particular case, Lance Corporal Carver and some privates with him took out a .5 caliber machine gun that they had come across, which was further up the hill than they were, and they could see the barrel against the sky, and it wasn't actually firing at that point, but he organized them, and they threw grenades, and throwing the grenades up the hill towards this weapon, they overthrew them so that the grenades would land on the other side of the weapon and therefore not risk coming down onto them. And at the detonation, charged the position and captured the machine gun, one prisoner who spoke English, and killed 2 others. Which was typical, basically, of many of the other acts of taking out enemy positions, which had been quite well prepared with Sanger-type erections of rock walls and peat, digging into the peat as far as the Argentinians could. After all, they'd had 2 months to prepare the positions on the mountain, which, on seeing them the next morning, did appear to be impregnable. And it was one of the surprises of the morning to see what we'd actually come up against. As we moved along the northern side of the feature, we came into contact with 4 platoon who joined us from the left. And I remember talking to Lieutenant Bickerdike and deciding how we were going to deploy what control we had of the various platoons, various sections, which had come into the rocks for cover from some of the fire that was being directed upon them by an enemy who I suspect were waiting for an attack from the northern side. And the minefield was, if not properly covered by fire, there was some fire going down upon them. And by the time I met up with Lieutenant Bickerdike, they had indeed taken some more gunshot wound casualties who were taken into the rocks with them. We looked up at the hill and assessed what we could best do, and Lieutenant Bickerdike moved on to get a better view of things as I was moving back to my sections, and was unfortunately hit in the left leg, in the thigh, and just rolled back into cover again. And he was so close to me that I patched him up there while everyone else was getting on with the job, literally. It was an ongoing situation at all times. The enemy positions would become visible either by fire or by fire being visible, or by the sound of gunfire coming from the positions, or by being discovered in the move forwards. And Corporal McLaughlin, one of my section commanders who was unfortunately killed the next morning in the artillery bombardment, was a very, very effective section commander who managed to keep his section together for most of that advance. I took 2 of his soldiers and went up the hill, climbed up the side of the northern feature to try and get to a high point to see if I could pinpoint enemy positions that were on the side of the hill. And we climbed up. I climbed up with 2 of his soldiers and did in fact see some blue muzzle firing, and we contacted some of the sections and told them of its existence, And we were surprised, in fact, by some shots immediately behind us, perched up on the rocks as we were. And remember Private Grinham spun around and put a few shots into it, and it was silent again. And there was an Argentinian tent, and a small position that was protected by rocks that we hadn't actually seen as we moved up. So by this time, 4 platoon and 5 platoon were basically on a front, fighting along the northern edge of Mount Longdon. 6 platoon had advanced up the top of Fly Half, the very summit, and even a little onto the southern edges, where they'd come across perhaps the majority of the Argentinian resistance on that feature, and had suffered many casualties in the process. And every time they exposed themselves, someone else was becoming a casualty. It was very difficult to locate exactly where, in all the rocks, the enemy were in fact hiding and looking at you. And one of the big problems, in fact, afterwards some of my soldiers told me that it did resemble, it would have been better perhaps had we approached the problem of the rocks and things more like a house clearing operation than an extended line fight through that we practiced several times. The company commander, after a period of a lull, decided that it was time to use some artillery, and we were all brought down from our positions at the end of the Fly Half feature and taken into a safe place. The wounded were casevaced away from the battle area, and in the process of actually taking those wounded guys out, other people got themselves hit, taking care of the casualties. And at least one man died trying to help a friend. Lieutenant Bickerdike had by this time been moved back to the casualty area behind some safe rocks in preparation for moving them back to the RAP. And Sergeant Mackay took over his platoon. And Sergeant Mackay decided that he wanted to do a recce as well. I remember him and one of my section commanders talking behind a rock about moving forwards and looking for a particular machine gun that was firing over to the north, and I believe onto the wing forward area where A Company were at that time. And he and my section commander moved off in this area while I went and helped with my Corporal McLaughlin, who was giving cover fire for that. And they managed to get some rocks, and we were sort of put under fire from another position further up the hill. And while dealing with this, we managed to move forward quite some distance, various elements of 4 platoon and 5 platoon, moving up the hill in a pepper potting fashion, which was almost instinctive to the soldiers. And we got to the top of the end of Fly Half, from where there was very little cover in terms of rocky outcrops, and we were lying under a very shallow couple of feet of ridge and throwing grenades over the top and giving the occasional burst of GPMG fire. And Corporal McLaughlin had managed to get some of his section up there. There was some 4 platoon at the top as well, and we got the word to draw back for artillery. So we came down the slope to discover that Sergeant Mackay had in fact died in his attempt to take out this machine gun, and Corporal Bailey, who'd gone with him, had received gunshot wounds in 3 places, and the 2 privates who went with him, James had managed to get himself isolated out in front of us behind some rocks, whilst McLarnon managed to get back to the rest of the covering party with them. After the artillery bombardment, Major Argue decided that B Company were going to make another push forwards, and the rest of the company, excluding 6th Platoon, who were still pinned down by sniper fire on top of the fly-half feature, were organised by myself and my sergeant, Sergeant Ross, with the help of Sergeant Fuller, who'd come forward to help evacuate casualties and move the platoons forward, and who'd been a marvellous help to organise the 2 platoons at that point. The strength of the new attack was very, very much reduced as compared to the company strength at the start of the battle. It was more or less a strong platoon that did the next part of the attack. And we moved forwards, and I decided to go on the north side and try to get forwards up at the ground we'd been on before coming back, withdrawing to allow the gunfire, the artillery to have their go. We deployed in single file and moved down on the north side of the end of fly-half feature, stopped at the bottom of the rocks, and once the artillery had finished, were given the word to go. We'd hardly gone 10 yards when I remember hearing the words, "El hombre," and an Argentinian stepped out from the rocks and started firing his machine gun, a long burst of automatic fire, down the line of my men. And they unfortunately hit Private Crow, who died immediately, and another few people, including Lance Corporal Carver, who'd earlier taken out a .5 machine gun, and also Corporal Heaton, my 2-section commander, in the leg, which he subsequently lost. The immediate reaction was to get the blokes into cover, and as there wasn't any cover available at that particular point, most of the platoon went backwards, and we were so close that we had to take out the Argentinian using a grenade on the spot, which we did. We subsequently found on moving forwards that he had 2 fellows with him who, after the grenade and 66mm attack that we made, had died on that spot. By this time we'd got forwards to an area where we had been before the artillery bombardment, and as we were searching the dead people there, myself and one other soldier, we were opened up on again, and some of the platoon, moving back into cover to get away from this dreadfully exposed rock face, were hit again, and pulling people back proved to be quite a costly operation. However, we managed to get that position consolidated, if you like, but had to withdraw to the area where the company had consolidated before the artillery. And at that point, A Company took over the battle.
I am Major David Collett, and I commanded A Company 3-para on the Mount Longdon assault. Before I go into the actual assault, I'll just give a bit of background detail of my whereabouts before I moved through B Company. My initial objective was to take wing forward, and then once that taken and the mountain taken itself, we were then going to probably push forward to Wireless Ridge. My company was a conventional company of 3 platoons, but in addition I had 2 sections of the anti-tank platoon, and I'd formed them into a company headquarters support group, which I'd also grouped my 384s from the platoon. So the platoons did not have any anti-tank weapons except for the 66s. We moved forward onto our objective without much incident initially, because most of the advance was done in dead ground from the enemy. However, on going over the top of the ridge, we began to receive initially, I think, overshoots from the enemy, and then direct sniper fire and machine gun fire from what appeared to us from our position to be well-sighted sniper positions using night scopes. During that time, I lost 2 men from sniper rifle fire, both being head injuries. We then went to ground due to the intensity of the fire and waited while B Company carried out their assault. I was unable to move forward because of the sniper fire, so the Colonel ordered me back and to move round through the B Company position and then continue the advance through B Company. When getting onto the position, I met up with Major Mike Argue, who commanded B Company. He then explained the position to me using an air photograph and a map, and I then formulated a plan. The problem I had was that the ground to my front sloped away from me and it was open ground. Also, the enemy on the next feature, which was full back, had a series of 5.0 and GPMG machine gun positions which were continually firing bursts in the area of my start line. I was going to use 2 platoons forward and 1 in reserve, 2 platoon itself and 1 platoon. Because of the weight of our webbing, I decided to ditch, the assault platoons would ditch their webbing to give them freedom of movement, and I also decided to move 1 platoon forward at a time. For the actual move, the FOO was moved forward to start putting down artillery fire, as were the MFCs, and I also moved the company headquarters support group forward with the 2 GPMGs in a forward slope position, which was actually fairly vulnerable, to start to try and suppress the 5.0 and the GPMGs. The advance forward by 2 platoon was begun by initially a section virtually going over the top, and they virtually had to move from rock to rock, one man following another, because of the lack of cover on the forward slope. And so the initial advance of A Company was slow, but I had told them that I didn't want any casualties if they could possibly help it, and to clear the enemy position as quickly but as safely as they could. And this they did, using grenades and 66s. And in fact, our only casualty in the initial phase was one of our own grenades exploding and injuring a man in the arm. Once 2 platoon had crossed over the ridge, I then told them to keep to the north, and 2 platoon then moved across and started advancing to the south. So I had a platoon on either side of the ridge line, and the GPMGs of the headquarter company group still continued firing. I might add, at that stage, we had fired a considerable number of rounds, and it was ammunition, in fact, at that stage for the gun was becoming critical. And if we had had to give covering fire for much longer, the guns would have actually had to cease firing. The move through the enemy position was done under cover of darkness and in the mist, so the extent of the position was not really known to us until we had reached the end and first light began to dawn. Fortunately for us, the mist stayed down, so although we could see the position we were on, we couldn't actually be observed by the enemy around us. And we then found out that it was actually a very extensive position with very well-made sangers, a large number of 5.0 and GPMG positions, and also a recordless rifle, which had been giving us trouble the night before. In addition, we found a 120mm base plate with 2 120mm. The reorganization itself, my the colonel had told me that I must not expose myself either to the east or to the south, because enemy positions were still occupied in these two, namely Wireless Ridge in the east and Tumbledown Mountain in the south. I therefore had to organise my company in a linear position on the north side of the ridge. We had to first obviously get our web equipment brought forward, and the reserve platoon brought these forward to the other two platoons. Because of the nature of the ground, the only positions we could occupy were the Argentinian sangars which they had left, and in fact we found these in the days to come to be very effective positions. On first light, sporadic enemy fire was received onto position, but because they didn't know our exact location, it was very sporadic and very inaccurate. One or two enemy were seen running or moving eastward along the bottom of our position, and these were engaged with small arms. As the mist lifted, so the enemy artillery fire began to fall in around us. The position was that on Mount Tumbledown there was probably a very strong position, which later the Scots Guards took. They had well-sighted RCLs and sniper positions facing north, and in fact 2 of my men from 3 platoon were held down by enemy sniper fire on the south side of the ridge for 4 hours because they just couldn't move because of the accuracy of the fire. And it took artillery, mortars, GPMGs to suppress these snipers before we could get these men back onto the north side of the ridge. The whole scene began to get unreal as the mist began to lift. Below us and around us we could see Argentinians wandering around, oblivious to the fact that we were overlooking them. And on the same hand, our own soldiers seemed to be oblivious to the fact that the Argentinians could see them. They were wandering around, even with shell fire falling around them, seemingly oblivious to it. I think probably this was due a lot to the inexperience, or the fact that they did not know what shells could do to a man, because the following day, after we had lost one of our men through shell fire, he was caught in the open on a resupply detail, the soldiers became distinctly more aware of the artillery and tended to stay underground a lot more. There was no doubt that the enemy could observe us very clearly, and they did use their FOOs with considerable accuracy. In one case, I had an O group going on. They obviously waited till I had all the officers present and then started firing at us, and it was quite amusing to watch all the platoon commanders bobbing around, because I, being in the strongest sang of the lot, could sit back and watch them. But it was a worrying time. We didn't have any counter-bombardment facilities. They were firing 5.5s at us from Stanley, and our artillery was out of range at the time. So it was virtually a case of sitting where we were and accepting the punishment. However, contrary to the teachings I had as a young subaltern that you don't occupy enemy positions, we found that these were the safest positions to be in. This then was A Company's ordeal on Longdon itself. The actual assault we had was not difficult from the point of view of the enemy were beginning to break up as we assaulted. The time which was when it was difficult was actually the 2 days afterwards, maintaining morale under enemy fire, shell fire, which is worse than actually coming under small arms fire. And I think the soldiers, after a time, could distinguish between incoming and outgoing rounds, and in fact became veterans within a day of being up on the mountain. One thing we did feel that during our time on Longdon and being on the forward slope was that the other battalions who attacked both Wireless Ridge and Mount Longdon never came forward, or we never saw them, and asked our advice on the movement of enemy either on Wireless Ridge or on Mount Longdon. And being where we were, situated on probably the forward position of the into the enemy camp, we did feel that they could have probably learned a lot more from us than from sitting farther back. So that's one thing, is going forward for reconnaissance.
You've heard quite a lot now about our advance across East Stanley and about the battle for Mount Longdon. I want now to round off the story and then to summarize with some of the more important points, many of which we have already covered, but I think bear repetition. On the morning of the 14th of June, I was giving out orders to my company commanders at the foot of Mount Longdon in a hailstorm, and I may say at that stage getting quite concerned about the physical debilitation and the physical effects on us all, from myself downwards, of the sustained operations which we had now been carrying out for several weeks. And I was beginning to become concerned that whilst we could continue to fight indefinitely, we could probably only continue to do so at an increasingly great cost to ourselves. As I gave out these orders, the word was passed from my own OPs and from two para, who were by now ahead of us on Wireless Ridge, that the Argentinians appeared to have completely collapsed and were pouring back into Stanley. Once this was indeed confirmed as being true, we saddled up, and that afternoon, on a bright, frosty, clear, sunny afternoon, we advanced over the forward slopes that you've heard described, that would have been subjected a few hours before to very heavy and vicious enemy artillery fire. We advanced, almost ran across that ground in great excitement, and down through Moody Brook, the objective which my C Company had been due to attack that night, along the race course, which again had been one of our objectives for the night of the 14th of June, and by that evening, before last light, we were into Stanley, with a feeling, above all, I think, of triumphant relief. I was especially relieved, and I'm sure this was reflected throughout the battalion and elsewhere in the landing force, that clearly here was a battle that we were bound to win in the end, but we were expecting to have to go on fighting through the Stanley Commons area, probably a very messy, nasty fight, which undoubtedly would have cost us more lives, more casualties, and possibly civilian casualties in Stanley as well. And it was an enormous relief, knowing that we were bound to win anyway, that the Argentines had suddenly collapsed totally in the manner in which they did. We then spent about 10 days in Stanley, where I may say there was a very severe water problem, and the only time of the whole campaign when I was worried about the health of my soldiers was in Stanley, where the water was bad and where a lot of people did go down with very bad stomach disorders. And during that period, some administration went on, reports started to be written, citations for gallantry were written, letters to the next of kin of those who had sadly been killed were written, and we prepared ourselves to embark on the Norland to sail back to the United Kingdom. We sailed back to Ascension Island, and from there we flew back, having been addressed by the Chief of the General Staff on the Norland at Ascension Island. We then flew back to Brize Norton and reunited with our families in early July. Let me return now to some of the most important points that I believe bear repetition from what we have told you, and this list is by no means exhaustive. The first is the importance of patrol work. This, like all the other lessons from this campaign, is not a new one. Read Defeat into Victory by Field Marshal Slim, and you will hear the same cries being echoed. But I believe it's true that the standard of patrolling skills in a battalion does reflect the standards that that battalion attains to. And furthermore, in our experience, the intelligence that came down to us from brigade and higher levels was of general background interest, but was not sufficiently detailed or specific to tell us what we were going to confront on our subsequent objectives. The only way to find out that information which subunits were deployed where, what the enemy's strengths were, where their machine guns were, what their general situation was. The only way to do that was to get out and to patrol ourselves and to find out that information for ourselves, and I believe that probably holds true in most situations. I may add a caveat here that the danger of patrol clashes was ever present, and we had one very serious one ourselves between a patrol from my A company and a patrol from my C company in the Port San Carlos bridgehead. This is obviously potentially a most damaging factor to the morale of the whole battalion, and there must be in every battalion a clear-cut system of identifying friendly from enemy patrols, probably by the use of the mini-flare. And that was a lesson we learned the hard way. Infantry skills generally, I believe the basic infantry skills, that is to say, the ability to march far and to fight hard on your feet, those infantry skills were not peculiar to the Falkland Islands, and I believe they are very, very relevant indeed to the mechanized warfare of BAOR. Do not ever believe that your tin can is going to stay with you in BAOR throughout the battle. It may well be destroyed very early on, and you will be surviving and fighting and living on your feet and moving possibly long distances on your feet. And I believe it behoves those, particularly who serve in Germany, to remember that. The importance of firepower I have already stressed, and it has come out during the other accounts. I have reformed, for example, a machine gun platoon in my battalion since returning, although I did have specialist machine gunners from my drums platoon during the course of the Falklands campaign. The value of the Milan against bunkers and rock positions in admittedly an extraordinary situation was very considerable, and I may say that Milan, like many other weapons, was being fired at much closer ranges than we generally train to fire them at. This applied also to Carl Gustav, and it applied to blowpipe. Generally, it seems in battle you are firing ranges at shorter, you are firing your weapons at shorter ranges than perhaps you generally do on training. The use of artillery you have heard much about, and this is, as it always has been, absolutely fundamental to the success of any infantry attack. The effect of enemy artillery fire has also been mentioned to you, and I think this bears repetition. The effect of the artillery fire that we were subjected to was depressing, and it made us very angry, and I believe that after a number of days of such experience, soldiers begin to become burdened and depressed and very angry by such fire. This was particularly frustrating because it appeared to us at battalion level that nothing was being done to locate or neutralize or destroy using special forces or air attack or whatever to locate and destroy the main enemy artillery pieces in and around Stanley. We appeared to be absolutely helpless in the hands of this fire. The casualties we sustained from artillery fire were generally men who had to move about, particularly stretcher bearers, for example, or those escorting a wounded soldier down the mountain. In one instance, for example, a soldier wounded by shrapnel was being escorted down the mountain, down a reverse slope, by two of his comrades, and all three were killed by one round of artillery fire. Artillery one could generally hear whistling in, and in fact the soldiers became quite expert at whether it was going to fall short of them, beyond them, or very close to them, and it was only in the latter instance that they would sometimes take cover. But with enemy mortar fire this was not always the case, and very often mortar fire one could not hear whistling in at all, particularly if our own batteries, now close up behind us, if they were firing and the noise was so great that one could not distinguish friend from foe. The enemy artillery threat was also the reason why we could not, exploit, as we would have liked to have done, onto Wireless Ridge on the morning of the 13th of June, sorry, the 12th of June. Tumbledown Mountain was still held by the enemy, and that dominated the low rolling terrain of Wireless Ridge, as well as, of course, the mountainous terrain of Mount Longdon. And I believe that on an exercise I would undoubtedly have advanced with my battalion across that ridge, and probably the umpires would have given it to me. But in reality it would have been, I believe, grossly irresponsible and would have led to heavy casualties. And it is significant that two para, although they were close up behind us by this time to the north of Mount Longdon, they attacked it by night, 2 nights later, concurrently with the Scots Guards attacking and taking Mount Tumbledown. One cannot afford to flirt with enemy artillery fire. It is too lethal. The command and control difficulties have been touched on, and I would simply re-emphasize here that command and control will be very difficult, and that any battle will be chaotic, unpredictable, very hard to control, and very confused. And this particularly perhaps applies to the fighting through phase of an attack. And that fighting through phase, in the case of our attack, went on most of the night, and the night lasting in excess of 12 hours by the time we closed during darkness with the objective. And therefore the importance of clear orders, the importance of a soldier knowing exactly what his part in the plan is, and his ability in terms of his confidence and his training to get on with the job he's been given to do, and not to be reliant on orders minute to minute or possibly even hour to hour, is absolutely cardinal if an attack by night onto a difficult objective with enemy prepared positions is to be successful. The importance of casualty evacuation and resupply procedures, perhaps at higher levels than, for example, the platoon commander needs to worry about too much, but the importance of practicing those procedures on training cannot be overestimated. They tend to be areas which we pay lip service to on training, and because they are awkward and inconvenient and tend to bring a dramatic exercise, if not to a halt, at least to interfere with its beautiful flow, they tend to be procedures which we cut corners on. We do so at our peril. The task of evacuating casualties involved my forming an ad hoc platoon of stretcher bearers from such people as cooks and clerks, and very, very well indeed they did. But it was necessary to have that force, and it was necessary to have it commanded and controlled at the right level, and my second in command, an officer of that sort of experience, was needed to oversee and to run this side of things during that night and indeed after. The same applies to the resupply of ammunition, because as you've heard already, automatic, particularly the belted ammunition for automatic weapons, you use a great deal and you run out of it quite quickly, and it is essential to keep the flow going, and we very often used our stretcher bearers to bring forward ammunition prior to them evacuating casualties on those same stretchers as they occurred. Going on from that, of course, the importance of battle first aid at the lowest levels, and you've heard this described, is absolutely crucial. And the surgeons, my own surgeon back at Teal Inlet, for example, who dealt with most of my serious casualties, but they all paid tribute to the high standard of life-saving battle first aid amongst the soldiers. On the one hand, an attack cannot flounder because so many soldiers become involved in it, but on the other hand, it is essential that lives are saved at that early stage, and it's at that early stage, before a soldier reaches the RAP, that his life is either saved or probably lost. And so that is a most important matter as well, and one which tends again to be ignored on training. I would emphasize, however, that under no circumstances should the need to deal with casualties interfere with the momentum, the forward momentum of an attack, and this matter was made very, very clear to my soldiers in their briefings before they even left the Canberra. It's not like Northern Ireland. You must press on if you are to be successful in securing objectives in conventional war. The matter of robustness is important, I believe, particularly for leaders. I found that there were certain men, non-commissioned officers and officers, who found the conditions and the general environment so demanding and so arduous that they had little left over in terms of their inner resources with which to command and to lead and to encourage and to generally take their place in the battle. There were not many instances of this, but I believe it is very important that in the selection of both officers and NCOs and in their training, that conditions are made as arduous for them as possible, and then they can start thinking about giving out orders, administering their sections or platoons in the field, and so on. It is no good trying to think you can train officers and non-commissioned officers in the classroom or select, the good from the average. You cannot. The confidence and the skills of the individual soldier are ultimately the battle winner, I believe. And also his feeling of being a member of a team. It is true to say, I think, that as far as team training is concerned, whether it be a gun group, a section, a platoon, or a company, that training should be as close to a dress rehearsal for the real thing as possible. And it goes back to my remarks about such matters as resupply and casevac. The closer it can be made to a dress rehearsal, the more familiar will a soldier be with his task when a war or a battle comes to be real. The system, therefore, of continuity in sections and platoons, of building up a corporate identity, a corporate spirit, of putting friends together, people who trust each other and know each other, is very, very important. And the buddy-buddy system of two men looking after each other for such things as frostbite, trench foot, and so on, and encouraging each other, particularly in defence and through periods of boredom, also is very important indeed. Perhaps I could appropriately finish with a reminder from Clausewitz, who said in one of his books that a soldier high or low, should not have to encounter in war things which, seen for the first time, set him in terror or perplexity. And I think if we bear that in mind in all our training, then we will be ready for war.